All right, here we are. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to the webinar today. We're going to talk about the part 1011 story. This is fantastic. I'm glad to see everybody join us this morning because this is a great topic. I don't know if part 1011 was ever great, Mandy, but I think it's time to make part 1011 great again. And so that's, I think, what we're going to try to achieve today is have a really good understanding of part 1011 and have a good talk about it, because I think it's one of the areas of the Ontario Building Code that we find people struggle the most with. And it is understandable that it is that way, and simply because there's so much misdirection. They're so easy to go the wrong direction, make the wrong mistake with where you're supposed to go in the code, making sure that you're only applying certain requirements in the new sections of the code when it's required. These are the real big stumbling blocks that I find when I go through the building code. So that's really what we're going to chat about today, is this part 1011 story, and give you a high level overview of how to go through this section of the code. All right, well, this is fantastic. It's great. We've got a lot of people registered today, so we still have a lot of interest in these webinars, and we thank everybody for the support. And we'll continue to keep doing these as long as we have a good following. And we've had some great responses from people, so we'll keep it up. Again, make sure you tell us how we can be better, because as we move forward, we want to keep polishing these presentations and training sessions as we go forward. All right, excellent. All right, well, let's talk about the webinar format. For a few of you that have been here before, you can understand the system, but let's go through it for people that are new or maybe had a little bit of hard time last time signing up for some of these things. So make sure you, after the webinar, we'll be sending you a recording so that you can look at this. So if you have to leave early today, or say you find someone that you know signed up that missed it, you're able to look at the recording, and that can help you go back through a lot of these items to refresh your memory. You can also use it, of course, to study and write down notes. So that's not going to have an expiry date on it. So make sure you sign up and click onto the replay. We're going to be doing some Q&A during the webinar. Usually the questions we'll deal with during the webinar are something that are very specific to the topic on the slide. But at the very end of the webinar, we're going to have a larger Q&A session. So if you have some larger issues that are a little more complex, we'll probably save those to the end just to try to get a better idea and take some more time. The people that want to leave can, of course, leave for that section of the webinar. During the actual webinar itself, you'll notice that on the right-hand side, you have a nice menu. That particular menu allows you to do a lot of things during this webinar. The first thing is the chat. So you'll notice there's a chat area, which I see a lot of you are wishing us a good morning and good morning back. So that's your chat area. If you have to ask a question, make sure you mark it as a question, and that'll help Mandy, who's going through these questions today, to be able to organize those, deal with them if it's applicable to the slide, or move them more to the end of the presentation for a more complicated or a more complex look into that issue. You'll also notice there's a polls button. So when you see any time on that right-hand side, if you start to see a red dot, you'll notice that something has come up. Click on that, and if it's a poll, you click on the poll button, it'll come up with the answers on that right-hand side. So that's how you deal with polls. And then, of course, we have the offers tab, which is on the side also when we start talking about our webinar training series moving forward from June until December of 2020. And of course, like I said before, give us your opinions. We really want to know what you have to say. The cast today, same as we've done for the past two. For any of you that do not know me, my name is Gerald Moore. I'm a building official. I've been for about 25 years. I've done work in larger and smaller municipalities. I've done plans exam work, inspection work, and CBO work. Currently now I work with RSM Building Consultants, which support municipalities in inspections, plan review, and code consulting. And of course, today I have with me Mandy Harris. She works with us here at RSM, and she's the Director of Plans Examination. And she has been doing that for about 15 years, and she's been doing inspections and plan review. And she's our resident expert at making sure plan reviews that we support are helped with the municipalities. Welcome, Mandy. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
Mandy, during the webinar, is going to be working on the questions. So anytime you have any questions, she's going to be organizing those and helping us through those.
So
All right.
That I will get questions. I sometimes flag them and leave them because I know something else is coming up. So I do get a lot of private messages after the fact indicating that I've maybe missed them. So just know that I have flagged them, and just because I'm not mentioning them right away, I will get to them.
Great, fantastic. So we have one more free webinar coming up next week. The webinar is going to be on mezzanines, and that's in 2 weeks. Sorry, that's in 2 weeks. We're doing these webinars every 2 weeks. And that'll be our last free webinar. We're going to talk about mezzanines. We're going to be discussing whether it's considered a story, the vertical fire separations. We're going to be talking about egress, and we're going to be talking about exits. So we'll definitely, it's going to be a good one. So make sure you stay tuned for that and get yourself signed up. And make sure you tell your friends. Definitely, it's worthwhile for that topic. Moving forward, starting in the month of June, we're going to be doing the bi-weekly webinars for the next 7 months. There's going to be 14 training sessions. We're going to be doing various topics. The subscription fee is $4.95, and that includes your access to the webinars and the recordings. And I have a few details on what all you're going to get with regards to that subscription. You'll notice on the right-hand tab, if you click your offers button, you'll notice that there is a link that'll take you right to our website, and that will help you get signed up. We also have bulk rates available. So for municipalities that have a few people that want to sign up, we have some options there for you too. CPDP approved through the OBOA, and we also have been in discussions with the Architects Association and OSET. When it comes to the OSET and architects, they're self-reporting, but definitely will provide you with some clarification and some confirmation that you have been at the course. Let's talk about the subjects coming up. Everybody's been asking us about what are these subjects that are going to be coming up in the next 7 months. And I've got about 12 here that we want to talk about, but we have some other options too for any of our subscribers who want to move forward with other topics. But these are topics that we want to dive into and spend our hour and a half discussing these technical items with regards to the building code. Everything from spatial separation to truss bracing and roof systems. We really want to get a good mix of Part 9, Part 3, and the Building Code Act. So these are the type of discussions that we want to have as we move forward to sort of give us a good discussion piece and have us all discussing what our opinions are on this particular topic. So stay tuned. These are what you're looking forward to as you sign up for our new subscription. Here's what you get when you sign up for the subscription. 7 months of bi-weekly courses, 21 plus hours of technical training. Now, sometimes we go hour and a half, so it could be up to 30 hours or 31 hours, depending on the topic that we do. Unlimited replays of the webinars. We're going to give you personal PDFs of each class. CPDP points, of course, are going to be provided for every session that you have, and certificates of completion. So that will definitely help you as you move forward into 2020 with all of your training needs. That's what we really want to do, is have us all talking about technical stuff. That's the way we're going to get better, is by having these fantastic technical discussions. Now, if you're an OAA member, an architect, of course, that you have to submit personally. But for us at the OBOA, we do everything for you. And we talked to Mike Leonard the other day. He said, please tell everybody not to call the OBOA office. Our first couple of webinars, they had over 200 calls, and they were getting, oh my goodness, what's going on out there? So we do it for you. As long as we have your email, your OBOA number one time, we keep it on record, and that every time you're here, we're going to submit for you your OBOA points. The number of hours is the number of points. I was a little incorrect at the first webinar. If it's 1.5 hours, it's 1.5 points. So it's really how many hours is contributed to the points. And of course, us at RSM, we are going to process this for you. So no problem. We'll send it in and make sure that you've got all of your points added to the system. This is a typical poll that we have for our sessions that we have here. And I want to know, what is your role as a building code practitioner? Of course, it gives us a bit of an idea, again, of who is in the audience. So as I'm talking, as Mandy and I are sort of discussing things today, it gives us a better idea of who we're talking to so that we can kind of trigger and focus our conversations on that particular type of background. And what do we got for some stats here, Mandy? What do we got?
61% building inspector, 30% plans examiner. So one engineer or engineer technologist, all those, and a few that fit into their own category, actually. A little bit higher than we've had in the past, I think.
Okay, fantastic. So it looks like we've got a little higher in those other sections. And after a poll, once we're done the poll, we publish the poll. So if you're interested in the stats, if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll notice some red dots. If you click on that particular red dot, which is polls, you're going to be able to see what the stats were. So that's really what you want to do, is you want to enter your information into the poll. And as we go through this particular webinar, we're going to have several polls there. So it'll give us an idea of what's going on, and it'll give you an idea of who's in the audience also. And let's practice again on our next poll. How comfortable do you feel working through OBC issues related to change of use and renovations? This could be and you know what? I think we're going to see a good spread here, because I know a lot of people struggle with it. So what do we have so far for the numbers, Mandy?
I would say about 60% are somewhat comfortable, but I find it difficult to navigate various issues. And then some 30% fairly comfortable, but they'd like to compare notes. And 10% not very. Okay.
All right. So it looks like the good thing is we've got some people with some experience in the group, and that's fantastic. So as we're going through these slides and having these discussions on this particular topic, make sure you add your questions in there, and you add some chat so that we can see what's going on in your minds as we move through these particular topics. And of course, on the right-hand side, we'll publish the poll for you so you understand who's in the audience and what's going on. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about change of use in part 10. That's the first topic we want to talk about. Then, of course, I want to dive into renovations and change of use in part 11. And part 11, this section is going to be a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about proposed construction. These are the things that you want to do. We're going to be talking about evaluation and compensating construction. These are the things you need to do. And then, of course, compliance alternatives, which are some areas of relief that are given to existing buildings in certain situations. So these are the topics that I want to dive into today as we go through this part 11, 10-11 story. The confusing path. The confusing path always is with part 10 and 11, especially in part 11, is how do I apply the building code for a particular project? And it can get very confusing. Do I apply new product or new code provisions to this particular project, even though it's an existing building? Or how do I apply certain new provisions to certain things and not to other things? So this is the confusing path that we seem to always have when we're looking through these part 10, 11 issues. Renovations. Okay, we've got a reno. Is it a new requirement? Do I go to the compliance alternatives? Where do I go here? And then how does change of use affect this? Do I worry about a part 10 permit, a section 10 change of use permit when I'm dealing with a part 11 issue? These are the questions that always seem to arise as people are going through these particular issues. And I think this is the crux of the part 10, 11 story, is getting stuck between all these different worlds. I know when you're doing any of these OBC exams, one of the things that makes it very difficult in this section is you almost have to know new code in order to apply part 11. And so you really have to be a bit of a connoisseur of the entire code in order to really apply part 10 and 11 to your particular project. We are going to be talking a little bit, I know, a question on 317 and 940 of the building code. We're not going to be drilling deep, but we are going to have some good discussions on that. So which door do I choose? How do I apply it? So here's another poll we have here to get an idea of the understanding of change of use. So again, on your right-hand side, you're going to notice that there is some polls. And I need to know, a renovation which includes change of use would require what permits issued by the chief building official? So would it be a change of use permit under section 10.1 of the Act, a building permit under section 8.1 of the Building Code Act, or would you need to have both? This is the question. And I think why I'm sort of stepping through these issues is I think this is a really good way of helping people understand of how it's applied. And what do we have for our numbers on this particular poll, Mandy?
Looks like it's wavered quite a bit, actually. About 45% of people say building permit under 810, 40% both, and 13 change of use permit.
Okay, excellent. Well, this is good. So if you look again on the right-hand side, you'll see the results of the poll, and you'll see really it looks like a split. Everybody thinks that you issue an 8.1 Building Code Act permit, or it could be both. So it seems to be split. Doesn't seem to be many people that think or feel that we need to issue a change of use permit under section 10. Okay. Now, I will have to say that why are people saying that this needs to be a building permit? I think they're saying that because I said the word renovation, right? And I think when you say renovation, you're saying construction. And when we have to do construction, that is the key. So in this particular case, I definitely see that you would require a building permit under section 8.1 of the Act only because we're doing construction. So that's great. It's great to see that we've got some mix here, but we're going to talk about this particular poll as we move forward. So I think the key is with a change of use is that when we're in section 10 of the Act, which sends us generally to part 10 of the Building Code Act, is that we're dealing with no construction. This is very clear in the Building Code Act, or in the Building Code Act when we're dealing with this. So what I've done here is I've provided a little bit of a roadmap. And of course, this roadmap is specific to a change of use. And when we do a change of use, we want to make sure we're using the right sections of the code. Again, this is the important part about part 10 and 11 is finding the correct path, not getting off the wrong path. Because if you go to a code provision that's not specifically detailed, you're not in the right spot. So under section 10.1 of the Act, it talks about this concept of a change of use. And it indicates that if you have a change of major occupancy that increases the hazard, then you have a situation where you need to comply with part 10 of the Act. And of course, compliance is dealt with in the code. And then we need to evaluate. Part 10 is really an evaluation. It's simply somebody with a clipboard going through each of these sections and saying, is there an issue here? Is there an issue here? Or is there no issue here? And when we go through this evaluation, we either come out the other side with one of two things. You either come out the side of a change of use permit under section 10, or you might be kicked out. They may say, you can't meet this provision of part 10. You're going to be kicked out, and now we need a building permit because you need to do construction. And of course, change of use has no construction in part 10. So I think when we look at the poll, that is the reason why people answered that it was a building permit, because the concept of doing a renovation takes you right out of part 10. So it's good to see that there is some people that have some really good knowledge of how to apply part 10. So essentially, part 10.1 of the Act tells us that if you have no construction, you increase the hazard, you need a permit. And that's the scenario of a change of use. I can tell you in my career, I've probably issued on one hand the number of hardly any change of use permits. The reason being is I always look at this as like a minefield. If you can get through that minefield without getting blown up, you'll get a change of use permit, but it is very difficult to do that because as we go through the scenarios and the evaluations, the part 10 is going to tell us, hey, you've got a lowering of a reduction of performance level. I'm kicking you out. You're going to have to go to part 10, 11. So that's the key here, is that you want to make sure that when you're dealing with change of use, there's no construction. Sometimes people want to do construction on their own, so they want to do construction. Well, if once they push that construction button, you don't go to part 10. You go to part 11, because part 11 is dealing with construction. And don't worry about the change of use issues. Part 11 is essentially it is a part 10, but with construction. So when we're dealing with a change of use permit, we really want to make sure that it's no construction. And that is very clear. And that's why most of the time we don't have a situation where there's no construction. All right, okay. So if you have that situation where there's no construction, then you're going to be on your way to a change of use permit, and good luck, because it's not easy to get one. So the code tells us that when you have a change of major occupancy that has an increase in hazard, that's when you need the permit. So to remind you again, at the very top left-hand side of the slides, we always put the code references for the issues that we're discussing. And in this particular case, it tells us what an increase in hazard is. So if you had a change of use with no increase of hazard, no construction, there's no permit needed for a change of use under section 10.1. But if you have an increase of hazard, then you are triggered, of course, to have this permit. Now, there's a table in the code that tells us if we go from an assembly occupancy to a industrial occupancy, it'll have a Y. It'll say, yes, it is an increase in hazard, therefore we have a change of use that needs a permit. Of course, if you change a residential occupancy from one to multiple or more than one, Group C residential occupancy, doesn't seem like a change of use, but the code defines it as one. So when we're dealing with our secondary suites, if somebody wants to do an apartment in the basement and they don't want to do a stitch of construction, they don't want to do anything. However, the fact of changing that so there is more than one residential suite, that's going to trigger a change of use permit. Likely is going to require construction, and they're going to get kicked out of part 10 anyways. So that's the idea of the C's. Farm buildings, if you have a farm building and you change it to a non-farm, that is going to be a change of use. I had an interesting story one year where I had a gentleman who had a farm building who set up a golf course in his farm building. And as I started discussing this with him, he said, well, come on in the barn. And I went in the barn, and lo and behold, it was an actual bar. This gentleman had done nothing other than add some fridges and freezers and put some beers in there with a bar. But that's a change of use, because if you change it from farm to non-farm, that triggers that requirement. Assembly to a casino, you change it to a post-disaster building. Say you have a warehouse and your fire department comes to you and says, hey, I want to move the fire trucks in there. That's a change of use, even though there's no construction. And of course, back in I think it was around 2018, could have been a little bit before, there was a lot of retirement home provisions that were added into the building code. So what they did was they said, if you change a residential occupancy to a retirement home under the Retirement Homes Act, that is a change of use. So really what Part 10 of the code is trying to do is it's trying to look at use and deal with the issue of life safety items, because if it was a farm building, you change it to non-farm, there's some real life safety issues. Give you an example, these wedding barns, definitely there's some life safety issues. They want the look of the barn. They probably won't change anything, but what they want to do is have the wedding there. And of course, life safety issues will be triggered through a change of use. So here's the path. Here's the path in this story. I have no construction. Let's go to the Part 10 house. All right, let's go to the Part 10 house. So when we go to this Part 10 house, the only people in this particular group that are going to the Part 10 house are the ones that are doing absolutely no construction. If someone's doing construction, guess what? They're not allowed to go to the Part 10 house. They're going to be sent to the Part 11 house. So that's something to definitely understand when we're dealing with Part 10 change of use. So all these people in line, no construction. When we get into the Part 10 house, we have this guy, he's called the performance level evaluator. And what he does is he asks specific questions and in order to find out if they're allowed to stay in the Part 10 house and get that change of use Section 10 permit. But guess what? A reduction in performance level is not permitted in the Part 10 house. Definitely not permitted. As soon as you have that issue, you are going to be kicked out. So again, it's like a landmine. It's like a landmine field. If you can get through it and you have no reduction in performance level, good for you. You've made yourself and you've gotten yourself from the chief building official a change of use permit. We don't do a lot of work in Part 10 because a lot of times people want construction. So let's do another poll. How do you evaluate the performance level in Part 10? So when we're dealing with Part 10, it always talks about this reduction in performance level. And so what I want to find out from everybody is how do you evaluate this performance level in Part 10? So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll notice that there is the poll again. And I have three different situations there and three different answers. The evaluation is determined by the chief building official's experience, or the evaluation is determined by the designer's experience, or the evaluation is determined by the code. And what do we have for our answers here, Mandy?
So it was 100% determined by the code, but now it's starting to waver a bit. We're down to 95. So a couple
Okay.
people.
All right. So what?
Unsure.
A couple people unsure. Well, it looks like, what is it? Not is it of almost 95% people? Yeah. Okay. So 95%. I think I agree with you. When we're evaluating a performance level, it's determined by the code. It's not determined by your gut. It's not determined by your feelings. If you look at a particular issue and you say to yourself, well, I don't really think that's the same performance level. That's really not the purpose of this evaluation. The evaluation is very specific in Part 10 where it tells you where there is a reduction in performance level. So when you're in Part 10 and you're going through, you have to go through the list of items to determine whether or not there is a reduction in performance level. And what you'll notice on this particular slide that I have here is I have 6 different categories that determine whether or not you reduce the performance level in Part 10. And I've given you a general discussion piece on this here, so we can have a general discussion on it. And of course, number 1, structural. If the new occupancy won't, and the supporting structure will not support the new dead or live loads created by the new particular occupancy, then it doesn't work. Where do you need to go? You need to go to Part 4 of the Ontario Building Code, and it'll tell you what type of loads you need for every particular type of occupancy. So when you look at that particular chart, in I believe it's 4153 of the Building Code, it'll say if you now have an office occupancy, you need this loading. Now, if you've converted a house to an office, a structural engineer needs to do a review. You can't just sort of assume that the loading, even if it was done earlier. So if you had something that was built really old and it was an office building, but then now it's being built as an assembly occupancy, we can't sort of take a guess. We have to have that evaluated. Now, there is one provision that talks about the fact that if you post a sign and that sign indicates the maximum loading on the floor, that also can not trigger a reduction of performance level. And I think the difficulty I find is that if I walked into a building with a sign saying maximum 50-pound floor loading, I think to myself, what does that mean? What is that? Like, the layperson doesn't know. So sometimes a lot of discussion comes down what you should do for that. And I know I saw on the list that we have a few structural engineers in our group today. So maybe that would be the question: are we able to get a situation where instead of saying maximum loading on the sign, are you able to do calculations to say this is the maximum occupant load to meet that structural design? Because I think that's something a layperson will understand, is that there's a maximum occupant load. What I like about that too is that we can tie that to the occupant load that's based on liquor license approvals, the fire department themselves, they're always dealing with occupant loads. So It would be something that could be very easily enforced moving ahead in the future. I like that. And I see I got a few people that are coming through in the chat that are saying a maximum occupant load. I like that too, because I think it does give us a real clear number of how to achieve this. So in this particular case, they would have to ensure that they do not have a reduction in performance level based on that structural issue. Early warning and evacuation systems need to be evaluated. So we need to take out that clipboard. We need to review that particular design. And when we review the design, we need to make sure that the early warning and evacuation systems, and we get a chart that's in the building code, are they met? This early warning and evacuation charts essentially sends you to sections of Part 9 and Part 3. So this is the key. We don't go directly to Part 3 or Part 9. We have to go to Part 10 first, and then Part 10 tells us exactly what provisions have to apply to this particular building. So that's the issue we want to have with regards to early warning and evacuation. Of course, hazard index, a few of you, anyone who's done the legal exam, you learn all about hazard indexes. So if you have an occupancy with a higher hazard index in relation to the construction index, then we also have a reduction of performance level, and the evaluator is going to kick you out of Part 10 as soon as he finds out that you have that situation. Residential combustible construction, if you have an old building that's made of wood, but would require it under 322 in Part 3 to be non-combustible, then that is a reduction in performance level, and you're going to be kicked out. Major occupancies in retirement homes, definitely there's separations between major occupancies, and there's this issue of having a retirement home from some other type of occupancy like residential. That's going to trigger a reduction in performance level. And of course, to finish it off, in our rural areas, septic and sewage systems, if you have an issue where your sewage system capacity won't be fulfilled by the daily flow, then you will of course also have an issue there. And the Part 10 evaluator is going to kick you and give you the boot out of Part 10. And you are then going to have to do construction. And when you have to do construction, you've got to go to Part 11. So that's the key. Part 10 really tells you whether you can stay there. And if you can't stay there, you have to do construction in order to fulfill the issues. So you're going to be kicked out into Part 10.
So some good conversation here, Gerald, is that so I believe some structural engineers are saying that they are specifying maximum occupant loads, but a few other good comments is to, look at the occupancy that you're dealing with, and it might include more than just persons. So,
I see.
Whatever's in that room or space, depending on the occupancy, might also be something to look at and keep in mind.
Okay, excellent. No, that's a good point. So if you've got an occupancy, there's going to be a lot of heavy equipment always there, then you should incorporate that into the occupant load calculation. So it might reduce that occupant load a little bit. Very good. Excellent. No, that's great. I'm glad everybody's using the chat button on the side here. Definitely give us your opinions. It shows us your opinions, and it also helps the group. We're all sort of hanging out and having some great discussions on how we can all make it better. One of the things I know that a lot of designers struggle with, Part 10 and 11, is tell us what you're doing. When we're going through this evaluation, really the designer needs to go through each of these categories that I have on the slide and tell us whether or not there's a reduction in performance level. And then if there is a reduction in performance level, then how's that being addressed? So again, we had some good discussions on our first webinar about a building code matrix. And there is some building code matrix out there, of course, for 3 and 9. The Part 11 and Part 10 matrices are there, and I think we need to use them and to be clear on how you're dealing with these particular issues. I'll be honest with you, though, sometimes we get a restaurant owner that's just moving into an old record store, and they may not have a designer on board, or they have a designer that doesn't have a lot of experience with change of use. This is what I see a lot of, and trying to work through these issues with the layperson who may not know these items can be a little bit difficult. But I think having somebody on board that understands the reduction of performance level will help it go a little bit smoother. So we're at the end of the Part 10 journey. When we get to the end of the Part 10 journey, essentially, you're getting to choose between two different permits. Well, I'll be honest with you, you don't get to choose. You're being told by the code. But if you have no reduction in performance level, then we get to issue this fancy change of use permit. And if there's a few building officials or CBOs out there or designers who have been able to see one of these things, good for you, because they rarely happen. Put a pin in it. That's one for your career, because getting through that minefield without having any issues is very difficult. However, a good designer understands where these minefields are, and when they see those, they know not to step on it. So they can then help their client. If they don't have a high budget, they could say, okay, you're allowed to have, you can't have this maximum, you can't have this occupant load because that's going to trigger a reduction of performance level. So if we reduce your occupant load slightly, then we can get through this with a change of use permit, and you really don't have to do anything to upgrade the building. So excellent.
Matt's just made a comment here, Gerald, that OAA's got a standard matrix, but it doesn't include all the information that we necessarily need to do the evaluation.
That's a very good point, Matt. I like that. It does sort of go through the steps, but I think the issue is it could be a little more detailed. I agree. And that might help everybody understand the process so that, you know, when a building official is looking at these particular items, they're less likely to miss them because they are articulated on the matrix. No, that's a really, really good point. I wonder, Matt, have you ever seen a Part 10 matrix? I haven't. It's very difficult. I don't know if I've ever actually seen one. So that ends our story with Part 10. Essentially, Part 10 is an exercise of evaluation, and a reduction in performance level is permitted. If you get a reduction of performance level, you are kicked out and you have no choice but to get a building permit. And when we deal with building permits, we have a different compliance path. Of course, it's going to send us to a different part of the code. The building permit itself under Section 8.1 of the Act will send us to Division A 112, which talks about the fact of whether or not we are a building that is greater, that is has been in existence for 5 years, or has not been in existence for 5 years. If it's been in existence for 5 years, then it tells us in the red box that we must go to Part 11. Part 11 deals with all of these existing buildings that have been in existence for more than 5 years. If the building has not been, then essentially the code is going to send us to all the portions of the code that deal with new buildings. And specifically in Part 9 and Part 3, there is 2 sections that deal with change of use within new buildings. And that is in Division B 315 or 940, which is in the green box on the left-hand side. So when you get to this point, you need to decide, okay, which way are we going? Now, I always get the question, is the building in existence when they poured the footing, or is the building in existence from the time when they occupy? I don't know. You're going to get a difference of opinion wherever you go. And maybe in the chat, if we could get some people telling us what their thoughts are on when they determine that 5-year point to be, because it's a big deal. It could be a few months. Or do you worry about it? You know, there's a lot of municipalities that are dealing with these change of use issues and are applying a lot of Part 11 provisions to buildings that are less than 5, basically more on policy and more on consistency. But, it's definitely something that there's a lot of debate on. So essentially what I'm going to be working on for the rest of the webinar is sort of dealing with Part 11 only when we're dealing with these situations. And in this situation, we have, of course, proposed construction, evaluation and compensating construction. And once we get through, we get ourselves a building permit. And when we're dealing with Part 11, we always have to remember that there is compliance alternatives, which we're going to talk a little bit later too. So I think if you could categorize this, you are able to understand how Part 1011 is organized, because it can be very difficult when you're going through these because of the way you're jumping all over the code. You don't read it from top to bottom. You're going to go to a certain part, it's going to jump you to somewhere else. It can be very confusing and convoluted. So here's our next poll. When I review, and this will be on the right-hand side, when I review or design a renovation project, the following is true. I review the project under Part 3 or 9, and then see if there's any relief in Part 11. Or I review the project under Part 11 and ensure compliance with the required provisions in Part 3 and 9. And of course, for some of us that are new to this, I'm not sure. I'm always lost. So give us a thought of where you are going to be in this particular poll. And what are we looking for here for our numbers, Mandy?
Well, we can actually just let people do the poll if you don't mind, Gerald.
Yeah.
A lot of people are saying occupancy date. So not everybody, but most people are saying occupancy date is the date for building is in existence. A few other comments too. Clayton, I don't know if Clayton's on here today, but he was talking about developing a Part 1011 matrix through the OBOA, I guess. I don't know if he has something. I don't know if anybody's seeing that. I know certain municipalities have their own kind of standard matrix form, but it is something that isn't. It varies from permit application to permit application. That's for sure.
Okay, excellent.
So polls, 52% review the project under Part 11 and ensure compliance with required provisions in Part 3 and 9. 41% review the project under Part 3 and 9 first and then see if there's relief in Part 11, and 5% are not sure.
Okay, excellent. Well, you know what? This is what I wanted to draw out of the crowd, because I think this is a very good distinction on this particular poll here, is that, are you going to Part 3 or 9 first and then checking for any relief, or are you going the other way around? And that's, I think, one of the biggest things I think that we can get out of today's chat when we're talking about these issues is which way you're supposed to go. And there should be a good, and you definitely need to find the right direction, or you're going to get yourself lost in Part 11 very, very quickly. So here's my answer. This is a good graphic. Worked on this for a long time to try to understand and try to get that concept. But I think you need to look at the fact that Part 11 is the key, a gatekeeper. This is the person who tells you where to go. You can't go meet Mr. Part 9, Part 6, 3, 8, and 4 without going through Part 11. Very clear in the code that the idea is here is if you're more than in existence for more than 5 years, you have to go to Part 11, and then you are told which appropriate areas that comply to this existing building from there. So if you are going directly to Part 3, directly to Part 9, and looking for relief, you are actually going the wrong way. You need to go to Part 11 first. If Part 11 doesn't tell you to go to a specific code provision, then you're not allowed to go there, and it's not applicable to the particular project. So I think this is definitely something that you want to sort of get from this particular discussion today, is that Part 11 is the gatekeeper. They will be the ones to tell you where to go. So you definitely have to, on your journey for Part 11 compliance, so you have to make sure that you go through Part 11 and then be appropriated to the appropriate section. So that's definitely something that you have to understand. Okay, so I think this is something that we're going to have a good talk about, because I think there really is a good spread here on how people have been applying Part 11. And I'll be honest with you, the debate of sound is long and hard fought with regards to especially our secondary suites. And I think when we're looking at applying sound provisions to a secondary suite, I would challenge anybody to find where you can go to sound through Part 11. And, it might be a tough pill to swallow for some people because they're like, how can they not apply sound to a new suite? Well, it's because the code doesn't require it. Sometimes I don't know why, the rules are made specifically, but I think the idea is this is an older building. There is some ease of construction that's been provided to them, and having to rip out existing floor systems in order to put in sound provisions might be is very onerous. So that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at these Part 11 provisions, is we go to Part 11 first, and then we see what particular new sections apply to the building code.
A question here, Gerald. How does it work when they are doing renovations, new construction? Are you advocating that code requirements to that new construction within the existing building has to go to Part 11 and only the other parts when sent there?
That is correct. When you go to Part 11, it is going to tell you when you can go to other parts. Now, sometimes if you're doing a new building system or something, yes, it's going to send you to Part 3 or 9. Or if you do an addition, it's sending you to Part 3 or 9. But the gist of it is, yes, you have to go through the gatekeeper in order to get back to any of the new code provisions that are proposed in the code. So I've split Part 11 into 3 different areas, and this is the way I always consider and always the way I look at it. It's the wants, the needs, and the relief. Under 11.3 proposed construction, you have your wants. I want to add this new kitchen. Or sometimes it's, I tried to get through Part 10 and I got kicked out, so now I'm forced to do something, but I want to have this change of use. But essentially the wants, when you're in Part 11, I want to remove this floor system. I want to remove this. I want to build this. So that's the wants, which is talked about in 11.3 of proposed construction. Then there's the needs. There's the things that you are forced to do through evaluation. This section is very much like Part 10. That's why don't worry about Part 10 if you're in Part 11, because Part 11 essentially is the same type of thing as Part 10. So these are the needs. We're going to evaluate the existing building, and if there's certain triggers that are hit, then you are going to be required to do what's called compensating construction, and that is the needs. Third is we have the relief. The relief is essentially the new code would require X. We're going to allow you to do Y because it's an existing building, and we're going to provide some relief for that section. So, and that's in 11.5. So that is the 3 particular areas and how I split up Part 3 in my, or Part 11 in my particular situation, is to get these 3 things through my head. So when we start talking about the wants, we have to talk about building systems themselves. So at the very beginning of Part 11, it gives us what a defined building system is. And of course, it could be a stair system, foundation system, roof system, HVAC system, plumbing system, insulation system. It gives us all these particular sections that talk about what a building system is. So when you're doing something, or you're altering, or you're installing a new building system, different rules apply. So you have to understand this concept of a building system in order to apply it for any particular element that's being designed or constructed under Part 11 of the building code. So building systems, it tells us that an existing building system, you can repair or you can alter, and you need to have an equal or better performance level. Now, I think the key here is it doesn't talk about a reduction in performance level. In this particular case, the way I see it, you can use your feelings. You can use your feelings here because it's not specifically giving us a particular trigger of a reduction of performance level. So if I take a stair like this particular beautiful one we have in front of us, it was built in 1901 and they want to alter it, they want to repair it, then they just can keep the existing performance level. They could have railings that may not be 36 inches high or the required new code. They are repairing or they're altering an existing building system. So in this particular case, you can paint it, you can pretty it up, it's allowed to stay. And this makes sense, of course, because as the code changes throughout the years, we're not applying new code to a lot of our existing infrastructure. So if it's an existing building system, it needs to meet the equal or better performance level based on the experience of between the contractor, the building official, and the designer that is sort of evaluated based on that.
Questions come up, Gerald. Is installing a new elevator considered a new building system?
I would say so. It wasn't there before, and it's definitely a new element to the building. So I think that definitely that would be a new building system. So that would send us back to other parts. We have a new or an extended building system in a building. So it right away in part 11, like we said, we go to part 11 first, then it sends us to other parts. So it's going to send us back to part 3, 9, 4, whatever the element is. So this particular stair here, it's installed in a old building, but it is a new stair, then it would need to comply with part 9 of the building code. So I think that definitely is something to consider here, is that that's how the path works. Part 11, then back to other parts. Now, there are some exceptions, and those exceptions are, of course, we'll talk about later, basic renovations and compliance alternatives. You always have to keep that in the back of your mind, especially with compliance alternatives. You think that's from the modern family, that stair? It could be, eh? Nice work, Todd.
So Mary's got a question here. What if the stair was built without a permit?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Mary. Yeah, if it was built without a permit, that's the key. That's a policy for the municipality. But in my opinion, it was never built under the auspices of any type of approval or any type of oversight. So I would consider it a new building system. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion that we have based on a municipality's liability and the statute of limitations and how far back they'll go. But I think that technically for the purposes of code compliance, I would say it's a new building system, because nobody, if it was built with a permit in 1860, which we had no permits in 1860, but that was okay. But, if it was built in the 80s, we had building codes in the 80s, and they decided to not get a permit. Now they have to legalize it. So definitely it can go back and forth, but in my opinion, it would be a new building system.
There's a few other comments here about barrier-free requirements. I'm not sure if you get into that actually, Gerald. So requirements from new universal water closets by some municipalities. Is this new systems?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure. We're going to come up to that. I think if we have a brand new washroom being installed that wasn't installed there before, I think it's pretty hard to say that's an existing or an extended building system. So I think if we have a new washroom that's totally in a different location, I think it's a no-brainer to me that it is a new building system. So basic renovations. The code talks about two different types of renovations, basic and extensive. When we're dealing with basic renovations, it gives us a statement that talks about we're allowed to reuse, relocate, or extend the same or similar materials. So if we have a particular building or a stair, gives us the typical debate of guards is one of them that is had through many municipalities. If you had a guard that was only 2 feet high, we would agree that's an existing building system. You can reuse that, you can relocate it, or you can extend it. That's permitted as long as you maintain the existing performance level. Now, again, this to me is your feelings. There is no specific reduction in performance level articulated in this particular section. So you would be looking at it, are we maintaining the existing performance level? Now, it's not the performance level of today with our guards because it's too short, but it definitely is maintaining the existing performance level. However, on the flip side, there is the arguments that can be made, and it's based on the statement goes on to say is that if you do that reuse or relocation, is that it cannot adversely affect the early warning and evacuation systems, fire separations, structural adequacy, or an unhealthy environment. And I know some municipalities make the call that allowing them to keep or extend that 2-foot high railing is an unhealthy environment. So that's what they're using. But I think there definitely is some onus here to allow for, especially when we're dealing with heritage conservation. The code does allow us some flexibility with keeping those features, even though they may not meet the requirements of today's code. Yes, I'm making some enemies on my judgments. Yes, yes, and some friends too. Thanks, Todd. Good comment. But that definitely is a debated concept, and please don't be too hard on me if you are on the other side of that. But it definitely gives us a good discussion so that municipalities can make their decision, designers can decide on what they feel, so that there can be some educated discussions on whether or not these basic renovations meet certain provisions.
Question here, Gerald. The new residential suite in the basement of a single-family dwelling greater than 5 years old. Does the existing exterior bare concrete walls require insulation?
Well, I think if we go through the scenario we've discussed, we look at the fact that the existing walls that are bare are existing. It's an existing building system. And when we're dealing with an existing building system, we have to maintain the same or better performance level. And I think we can agree that the bare concrete walls staying bare after has the same performance level of before or after your particular renovation. So that's in proposed construction. When we start to go through the evaluation, that's the second step. We see, do we need to upgrade? So we're allowed to keep existing. Do we need to upgrade? I think you're going to find that insulation is not a evaluation and an upgrade that we go through. So in my opinion here, I would say that if someone has an old building with no insulation, they choose to keep no insulation, then that is permitted under Part 11 of the code.
There's a few other questions here, but they're pretty specific, so I'm just going to leave those to the end for now. I flagged them though, so.
Perfect. All right, when we're dealing with extensive renovations, the code talks about the fact that if you have walls, floors, ceilings, and roofs, and they are substantially removed and replaced, that 2 areas you're sent to for other parts: fire resistance and structural. So right away, if you do this particular issue, you have to go to the new code for the structural issues and the fire resistance. And I don't see sound in here. So I think this is one of the issues with that comes up with sound, is that we're sent for structural and fire resistance. So that is where we're being sent. So the floor system, if it was extensively removed and reinstalled, we've got to make sure that it meets the structural requirements. And of course, if it's removed and we need a fire separation due to an issue of the suite below, then we have to have that in accordance with new code. But keep in mind at the very end is we always have compliance. In some cases, we have compliance alternatives. A good discussion, Pavel, about what is extensive. I think that really comes down to the judgment, and that one can be a tough one to do. I think what I noticed on this particular provision of the code is, some people say, well, I removed just the drywall and the ceiling. Is that substantial? Well, when you look at the provisions of the code, it specifically says ceilings. It doesn't say walls, floors, and roofs by themselves. It has ceilings in there. So this could be a controversial one, but I think the fact that ceilings is listed there kind of puts an onus on the fact when you remove any type of ceiling system that's attached to the floor, there may be an issue here where you need to now comply with the fire resistance elements in the particular suite. Now, I had a discussion with another building official. I think Jonathan's out there. We had a discussion on the order of which things are done. Sometimes if you have a situation where a contractor removes the ceiling and then later on tries to apply the relief provisions to that, can be difficult. In the end, you would say, well, what's the big deal? But if you follow the path of the code, if they took the old ceiling down, it's going to force them to have the fire resistance new requirements, as opposed to leaving the ceiling, and then they may get some relief when we do the evaluation to let it be 45 minutes as opposed to an hour. So sometimes that can get a little bit tricky in Part 11 too, is with the order of which the work is being done and how things like existing provisions are detailed.
So there's a comment question here. If current performance level is greater than current code would require, can performance level be reduced to current code level?
I think I know which area you're talking about. I hope I get it, but I know there's a provision in the code now, especially with regards to assembly occupancies, where the floor system, if you go through part 3, would require something like an hour. But if you go through the part hazard indexes and the compensating construction, it says an hour and sprinklered. Now that's a tough one. I know I've struggled with that one for years, and in some particular situations, based on the project, I've permitted the new code requirements. I don't know whether that's right or wrong, and maybe there might be some chatter on that, but I have a hard time thinking that it should be more onerous for Part 11 than a standard new building. So I have done that in that case is I haven't applied both provisions, but that definitely is something that it can be debated. So I just happened to notice here, there's a question from Mark. What if you removed and replaced the ceiling in order to repair an existing fire separation upgrade? Well, I think, Mark, if you remove the ceiling membrane, you're removing your possible allowances in Part 11 relief in order to give you some breaks. I think you want to make sure that you have to keep any existing elements, may give you some relief later. If you start ripping it down and pulling it all apart, that relief may be thrown out the window because now you're having to put on a new building system.
There's a lot of discussion here, Cheryl, just in terms of just what you were speaking to. People are still, I think, unclear a little bit about when you do remove something, or when you're speaking of a ceiling, would that really be considered in basement apartments when the system you are rating from the underside is actually a floor system, not a ceiling?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and some of the times when we're looking for our wisdom of where we can go, and we just keep reading the same sentence over and over again to see if we can get something out of it that we didn't before. It is definitely, I'll tell you, this ceiling issue is definitely something that is widely discussed. To me, I think when you apply the provisions of a secondary suite, the issue of replacing that ceiling comes up a lot. And I really do say that if you replace the ceiling, because ceilings is specifically listed in the code, that entails you've substantially removed the ceiling. That's my thought on it. Maybe there's some other thoughts in the group, but that ceiling itself has been articulated. So I don't think you can say, well, I only took the drywall down from the floor system, so the floor wasn't substantially removed. I think there's a reason why the code writers put in ceilings, but I don't know who those people are, and we might have to ask a few questions from them, but we typically don't get more direction other than what the code tells us. I see a couple questions about the ceiling as a separate building system. I really think, again, like I said, it's specifically listed in Part 11 as under some extensive renovations. So, that's my thought on it, is because of it being specifically listed. This is good. This is a good debatable provision here on these extensive renovations with regards to especially that ceiling membrane, because it comes up quite a bit. When we're dealing with extensive renovations, it kicks in some upgrades. We're not going into the evaluation section yet. It right away triggers you some specific upgrades. Barrier-free, residential building provisions, and retirement homes. So if we talk about barrier-free, this is definitely something that is widely discussed. But if you substantially remove floors, walls, and ceilings, and there's three triggers. There's the three. I told you the one where you substantially remove the walls and the floors. The second, is there more than 8 inches from grade to the floor level? And the third provision is 300 square meters. If you're greater than 300 square meters, if you meet all three of those provisions, then you need to upgrade the floor, right, to barrier-free provisions, anything that you're removing. So if it's a new bathroom, like a handicap bathroom, if it's a new office on that floor because it's a new wall in the office, If any of those particular existing walls aren't being removed, then okay. But if you have new offices and new boardrooms, new lunchrooms, then this extensive renovation provision is going to kick in the requirements of barrier-free. Now, you need to meet all three of those provisions. It's not just one of them. So you have a close enough floor to grade, you are large enough to accommodate the barrier-free provisions, and three, you are moving the walls and doors, walls and subfloors. So that forces you into these barrier-free provisions. Now, even if you don't meet it, so say if you have an extensive renovation and you don't meet those three, you also have to look at what I call the barrier-free light provisions. These are the provisions that aren't fully barrier-free, but it still forces requirements like sink clearances, grab bars for toilets. So you either have full barrier-free or you have barrier-free light when you do these extensive renovations. Residential buildings, if you go above a certain story height, then it's going to trigger some sprinkling of the building. And retirement homes, if you change to a retirement home, it's going to trigger some sprinkling requirements, some door closers, and a few other requirements. So when we're dealing with these three particular provisions in extensive renovations, you are going to be definitely increasing the requirements there. You know, there's some good discussion that seems to be coming up on the assemblies, which I'm liking, is that there seems to be some debate and disagreement with my ceiling opinions, which is, it's good to see the differing opinions, is that, you know, a lot of them are saying assemblies include the ceiling membrane, so that wouldn't that not be an assembly? So there's a lot of good debate on this particular issue. Yeah, that's a good question. I got a question here about what if the building was barrier-free previously and you're no longer required to meet the barrier-free requirements if you don't meet all three provisions? I know that the ministry has struggled with this, and I know that they have been given, and working with a few municipalities, we've asked for their opinion. That are barrier-free anymore. How can that be right? I don't think that's the intent of the code, but so I think a municipality needs to make a particular policy on that, because I don't think that's the intent. But certainly the way the code is written, it seems like a way to maybe stick handle around those barrier-free requirements, which I don't think is the intent. The intent is if your building is big enough, it's close enough to grade, and you move these walls around, that barrier-free needs to apply.
There's a lot of discussion here, Gerald. I'm having a hard time keeping up here with all the questions.
Well, what we can do is, as we go through this information, the people that want to stay, we can sort of maybe step through these things and tackle it at the end of the presentation. We'll keep going through the material and we'll come back to it. So we have another poll. The next poll is, how do you evaluate the performance level in Part 11? So on the right-hand side, make sure you click your poll button, and oh, I screwed up here, I think, and stop the poll. Let me go back. How do you evaluate the performance level in Part 11? If you've already answered, answer again. Unfortunately, I clicked the wrong button here. The evaluation is determined by the building official's experience. The evaluation is determined by the designer's experience. The evaluation is determined by the code. Okay, so we've just talked about proposed construction. These are the things that people want to do, either basic or extensive renovations. Now we're going to get into the section of the code that talks about evaluation and compensating construction. So I think we have a really good understanding here, don't we, of the group, Mandy?
Yeah, looks like everybody's got it.
Yeah, the evaluation is determined by the code. That's what we seem to be getting for the answer on this particular poll here. And that's true. That's the way we want to look at it. We really want to look at the fact that there's no feelings in this. When we were dealing with basic renovations, there was a bit of feelings. It didn't tell us exactly how to evaluate that performance level. Perhaps maybe that's why it's the most difficult to understand section. But this particular section here is very specific on a reduction in performance level. And of course, these are the things that you need to do. The owners, the designers, you necessarily don't want to do these things, but based on what type of occupancy, they are being forced to provide upgrades. So 11.4.2 talks about this evaluation, and it's all about a reduction in performance level. When we have a reduction, we need to do something about it. And of course, we need to bring it back up again. If you reduce the performance level, we now have to restore the performance level. And the code calls this restoration of performance level compensating construction. So we've reduced it based on all of our questions. We've done our evaluations. You've increased the occupant load above the requirement of a fire alarm system. Oh, that's going to trigger a reduction in performance level. And then it's going to take us to compensating construction and say, oh, now you're going to need to restore it, you're going to need to install a fire alarm system. You know, the way it's particularly organized, I don't really like the way Part 11 is organized in that it has the evaluation up here and the compensating construction. I typically like to go through the structural requirements first, see what they all are with the evaluation. Then I go down to what's the compensating construction. Once I'm done that, I go up to occupant load. So I go through each category and I look at the evaluation first, and then I look at what do I do to restore it by providing that compensating construction. And that's the typical exercise when we're doing a Part 11 analysis. So when we're looking through this evaluation of these needs, it's very similar to Part 10. So really, we're applying that Part 10 provisions to Part 11 buildings. So structural, same deal. If you reduce the performance level based on occupant load or change of occupancy, then it's going to trigger specific compensating construction. Typically, what does that mean? An evaluation by a structural engineer to ensure that the new loads can be accommodated by this change of use, or posting the sign. And we had a bit of discussion on what we should do when we post that sign. And a lot of people seem to be of the opinion, and I agree, that we should try to associate that with occupant load, keeping in mind some other type of equipment that might be on that floor. But definitely, a structural engineer will be someone that will be looking at all these particular provisions to ensure that the proper sign and occupant load is set. The next provision is occupant load. The 15% is that trigger number. If you increase that occupant load higher than 15%, then it's going to trigger a reduction in performance level. There's requirements specific to fire alarm systems and exit widths. So occupant load is definitely an evaluation that needs to be done. And subsequently from there, if you trigger that, it's going to then throw you into the new code section. When we get into those early warning and evacuation charts, it's going to say, okay, you've increased the occupant load. Now we have to look at exit widths. Now we have to look at the requirement of a fire alarm system. Now we have to look at travel distance requirements in the new code. So this is where, again, the gatekeeper is Part 11. We go to Part 11, we've reduced the performance level. Now it's forcing us to go to Part 9, Part 4, or Part 3 when we're dealing with these new code provisions. So that's why at the beginning, when I had that poll talking about, do you go to 3 and 9 first, then look at 11? That's the opposite way to look at it. You want to go to Part 11 first, then it sends you to those other appropriate sections. Change of major occupancy, of course. If you change the major occupancy, then we're going to be doing a hazard index evaluation. So when we do our hazard index evaluations based on the type of occupancy, it's going to say, well, that's a higher occupant or a higher hazard index. That is going to trigger some upgrades. Based on those upgrade changes, or based on that, if you have a reduction of performance level, this is the section that also sends you to several areas of the new portions of the code. We have to look at washrooms, which is also looked at an occupant load. Now we have to relook at the washroom numbers to make sure that they're meeting. We have to relook at, do you have a new pool in there? Well, the pool needs to meet it. The spa needs to meet it. Ventilation requirements have to be reviewed under Part 6. So this, again, is that conduit where we get to the change of major occupancy, and then compensating construction is going to send us to all the appropriate new code provisions that will apply to this particular change of use.
So there was a question previously, Gerald, about talking about just the small, medium, and large buildings. So when you're using these hazard index tables, I think the question alluded to perhaps how you determine whether they're small, medium, and large.
Yeah, so when you look at the very bottom of each table, you will see a specific trigger for those three particular sizes. So when you look at small, medium, or large, now they're not the same for every occupancy. So you need to make sure that when you pick the hazard index, when you're at that hazard index chart, you go to the very bottom of the hazard index chart, and it's going to show whether it's a large, medium, or a large, medium, or small building based on the size and number of stories. So that will be at the bottom of the table. Something to keep in mind, of course, is in Part 11, it does give hazard index reductions based on if it faces more than one street. So there sometimes is some reductions. So make sure you don't miss those reductions based on medium or small buildings. You know, a good question here I got from Mary: existing occupant load based on the table or design? And, you know, that's definitely can be a debated one too. I know if you go by the words of the code that an architect or designer can determine the occupant load for the new. Now, what was there before? That's definitely, you know, if there's records in the municipality, that's easy, right? Does the designer, they're not really designing the old space. So I think it's not really applicable unless they have some type of maybe background or some old documents that can confirm that old occupant load. But I think if nobody gives you an occupant load or you're not satisfied with it based on records, I think you would probably have to use the table. That would be my thoughts.
Another question here, Gerald. There are some places in Part 11 that pushes you to Part 3, but not Part 9. If you have a Part 9 building, can you assume that you would use the equivalent Part 9 references rather than using Part 3?
I would say no. I think you got to be very specific in Part 11. If you're sent to it in Part 3, good. If you're not sent to it in Part 9, no. Because again, way I always look at code is that if you can't write an order, if you can't do a code path through it, then there's no applicable route to get there. And I think that's the importance of Part 11, is that you really have to read it strictly, like a strict interpretation of this is the code provision I've been sent to. Part 11 is the gatekeeper. I've been sent only to this code provision in Part 9. Plumbing's pretty easy. Essentially, if you do any plumbing, any new plumbing, you're going to have to comply with Part 7. For anyone in the rural areas with sewage, you always have to look at the provisions of flow and whether the components of the sewage system are of the capacity that would meet it. Of course, if we have single-family dwellings, it's triggered by an additional fixture or number of bedrooms or a certain square footage. 15% is that number of square footage. I think you really got to be careful on sewage. There's been a lot of municipalities that have paid out issues of sewage systems when they weren't properly upgraded due to provisions. I look at it this way. We all know sewage systems don't last forever. And the code really looks at this as a way to say, hey, you're doing an addition, it's time to upgrade or at least evaluate your system. A lot of the old systems, though, won't meet today's provisions. So I think very clearly in the code, you need to look at the sewage system. Now, I don't think you can really just take a look at the size of the tank. You really need to get an idea of, you know, is this an appropriate tank size? Do we have a big enough filter bed? Do we have enough pipe in the ground? All this stuff has to be looked at to ensure that it meets the requirements. Combustible construction, of course, there's a trigger that if you increase a building greater than 3 stories in residential, it's going to force some requirements for sprinklering. So I think the big issue here is this is the crux right here. This is the roadway that gets us to the new building code requirements in Part 3, Part 9, and Part 6. You first have to evaluate Once you evaluate, then you go to compensating construction, and that's going to send us to those other particular areas. Our other idea, of course, concept in the building code is the relief. We talked about the wants, proposed construction. We talked about the needs, which is this evaluation and compensating construction. And the last element, of course, is these compliance alternatives. The compliance alternatives can be used in lieu of new code requirements. So if you're required to have a particular size door in the new code, you can look in these compliance alternative charts and it may give you a reduced requirement based on the fact that it's an existing building. And so you want to always make sure that you check those compliance alternatives. Now, the big thing to remember is that based on the part of the code you're dealing with, there's a difference. If you're dealing with a part 3, if an issue in part 3, 4, 6, or 8, then the chief building official has discretion. They are able to say and have an opinion on whether the construction difficulty will allow the use of this reduced provision. So in these particular cases, the CBO and the municipality has some discretion on whether or not they think these are applicable. When we're dealing with parts 9 or 12, there is no discretion. The code says that without the chief building official being satisfied, these can be used. So if you're in a part 9 building or you're dealing with a part 12 issue, there is no discretion. The designers can simply use it. I think the key here is that if you're using the compliance alternative, it really does help all the review process if you use the number associated with the compliance alternative. You say, we're using a certain fire separation and we're doing it due to C193. And that will really help that code pass. So in your building code matrix, I would list all your compliance alternatives. It's definitely something that can save you time with your approvals because the building official is going to be able to very quickly follow you along.
Just a comment here, question, Gerald. Speaking to you, sometimes when they design, they like to stay within part 3 or part 9 as opposed to using the compliance alternatives and the path through part 11. So they're just looking for a comment on this area.
Well, you know what? I think if you design it under part 3, sure. Most of the time, I would think almost 98% of the time, like that one issue we talked about earlier, is that part 3 or 9 requirements are going to be more restrictive than part 11 path. So I don't see an issue with somebody applying part 3 or 9 based on the fact that it's a more onerous requirement. I have had some discussions before on can someone use part 3 here and part 11 path here? Can they pick and choose? Well, I think it depends. I think we need to look at each individual issue, and if part 3 is more onerous than, which it almost always is, or part 9, then that definitely to me would be okay, because we're looking at minimum requirements here and it's met the minimum. So definitely in this particular case, let's make sure we put those compliance alternative provisions on the building code matrix. So that was our discussion, and the main point of our webinar today was to have these discussions, and we of course went through change of use and renovations. So if you want to stick around, we're going to have some questions on some of the things that we've had that we really didn't have time specifically to go through on the webinar, but we're definitely going to talk about those and get to the question section. And so if you could look in your chat box right now, if you've got some particular ideas on how we can improve our training sessions for you, please start putting them in the chat right now. We record the chat, and if you want to send them private or public, it's up to you. We definitely want to try to make these better so that as we move forward, we can all get our code technical juices going and help us as we meander through these requirements. Also, make sure that if you go through the replays and you relook at this particular webinar, you can send in questions right from the replay that will be emailed to us here. So if you have a particular question, we can give you our input as we move through the replay. So you would just type it in and it's emailed to us, so we can answer those questions for you. So definitely thank you, and give us some thoughts on this particular sessions that we're doing. As you continue to put that chat in there, we've got one more free session coming, and that's in 2 weeks on May 27th. We are going to be doing a discussion on mezzanines. So definitely take a review of your mezzanine technical price, and let's have a chat about that on May 27th. So that's going to be our next webinar. If you've already registered for the 3, then you'll be all set and ready to go moving forward. You'll get the same reminder emails and the links that'll take you into our live room. Moving forward, we definitely want to keep this going, and we want to keep having these discussions on these particular topics. So sign up for our bi-weekly sessions starting in January or in June. June till December, we're going to be having these sessions. It's $4.95 for 14 training sessions, and that will allow you to take part in these and keep your technical skills improving as we move through the year. Just like at the beginning of the webinar, we've released our particular topics that we want to discuss moving forward from June. We're excited about a lot of these topics, and we're looking forward to these discussions. We're going to be doing part 3, part 9, and definitely some Building Code Act stuff. One of the items that I wanted to definitely have a good chat was documentation for part 3 occupancy. I know that that's definitely something that makes it easier for contractors when they know the exact list of what they need. And I wanted to have a discussion on that particular item. Hold open devices, truss bracing for roof systems, and of course, engineered floor systems. There's a lot of discussion on how we apply those particular provisions. And of course, we will submit the CPDP points for the OBOA for you, and OAA members or OSET members definitely will provide you certificates so that you can submit these for your particular membership continuing education training. When you apply for this particular from June, you're going to get 7 months of bi-weekly courses, 21 plus hours of technical training, and you can look at the replays. You're going to have access to those. You're going to get PDFs of all the documents that we have, and of course, like we discussed, the points. Bulk rates for larger municipalities, I've put them up here on the slide. So if you have several building officials that are wanting to sign up from your municipality, we are providing bulk rates. We have quite a few people signed up for it right now in June, and we've already had a couple of larger municipalities, and we've been providing the bulk rates for them to help them with expenses. If you have over 30 people on your list, you pretty much get 6 people for free. And yes, taxes would be on top of that. The government, of course, will take the HST on top of the $4.95. I'll give you an idea of what RSM does, of course. We put a little slide in here, is that for any municipalities, essentially that's where we provide most of our work. We provide plans, examination support, inspection support, mentorship, and training workshops. We also do in-person training shops. So please reach out if you're a municipality and you need some help with plans examination or some inspections or mentorship. Please reach out. We'll see how we can help you. We definitely are here to help improve the industry and to share what we know. We have a lot of retired building officials that work with us that help us with inspections, and we have lots of senior plans examiners that can tackle any type of large and complex project. We're here to help you. We do our best in our sessions to give the best information that we know how, and to give our opinions without worry about whether or not they're agreed upon or not. And this is not to sort of say this is the way things has to be. It's to generate discussion. That is what we're here about, is generating discussion. So if you're a building inspector, make sure you talk to your CBO about the concepts that we've talked about today, because it could be different based on their interpretation. Also, if you're a designer, make sure you're talking to the municipality. They're the authority having jurisdiction, and they're the ones with the interpretations that need to be applied to the municipality. So we really hope that our opinions are used in a way that can get discussion to get better understanding, but definitely you need to do that double check to satisfy yourself that it complies. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start with the question and answer session. So some of you have asked questions throughout the webinar, and some of them that might take a little bit of thought. We might have to dig into the code. So if you want to stay around and discuss those issues, we're happy to do that for you?
Yeah, Gerald, there's a lot of discussion. Basically, there's a lot of similar chats for barrier-free when that applies, when it doesn't, and then back to the ceiling assemblies and things like, what if you have a ceiling assembly and they want to put pot lights in? Then what do you do? So I think we can clear off a lot of questions if you just want to have a basic chat about that.
Yeah, I think with regards to a ceiling and putting in pot lights, there are provisions in the code. Now, this is, sometimes when we look at some of these code provisions, it's not always exactly where of the compliances you're looking at. And I'll give you an example. For a pot light, if you have an existing pot light, then it's an existing system. There's some discussion on whether that would be okay. If we apply that to a new building, per se, and say it was a steel housed pot light, well, we have provisions in the code for brand new buildings. If you have a steel duct that penetrates a ceiling membrane, and you're actually okay to do that in SB2, if you look at the particular chart in SB2 of openings through a ceiling assembly membrane, there are provisions that allow no protection. So you could have a 4-inch hole with no protection at all. If you go over a certain size, then you need a thermal barrier on the top face or a fire stop flap. So there are provisions that even allow these in new buildings. So I think the way I would look at it is if it was a new pot light, you should provide a new provision to it, and it still might be okay to have that pot light. Now, the new pot lights that we're seeing are these puck systems that really have no box behind it. It's just a plastic piece of plastic. Those, I think, are an issue. You're going to have to deal with doing something there because they're not like an HVAC duct. Even that's an interpretation of how I look at it, as if it's an HVAC duct. But these small little pucks, I think you would have to provide some protections there because there is no metal duct coming through it per se.
So what about adding access panels to an existing ceiling?
So it's a you can look at that as a new. It's not necessarily a new building system, but if it doesn't meet any of the compliance alternatives, then a new penetration in a ceiling of an existing ceiling would then either have to meet the provisions of SB2 or put a rated ceiling panel. And don't forget the compliance alternatives. The compliance alternatives also have some exceptions for existing. Now, this may not be an existing one, but sometimes when you have existing openings and you look at it, you're like, oh my goodness, check the Part 11 compliance alternatives. There may be some relief.
There's a question going back when we were talking about all the assemblies too. When the code talks about assemblies, just back to this discussion again.
Yeah.
Just what's an assembly and what's not. So I think that's a debatable topic.
Definitely. It's debatable. It's debatable because there's no definition of it. I think really, as much as we try to make the code black and white, there definitely is some interpretation with regards to what an assembly is. I think and is it substantially removed? That's another word that is very difficult to interpret. But I think that comes down to discussions between the designer and the building official on what is substantial. I do though think, like I've said before, it might be a controversial one, but I think the fact that ceiling is specifically listed, does that mean ceilings need to be applied separately from a floor system? Definitely food for thought.
So Jordan's got a question here. If we remove the ceiling in a secondary suite conversion, we are forced to Part 9, other parts as per 11.332 sentence 1. However, before we fully leave Part 11.5.112 pulls us back to remain in Part 11 because compliance alternative C152B permits a 15-minute horizontal fire separation if we install smoke alarms and interconnect them through both units. So if I removed my existing half-inch drywall and wanted to replace with new half-inch drywall, I could if I conformed to C152. So the question there would be, if you take off the drywall, put on the drywall, can you still get your compliance? Use the compliance alternative.
Yeah, that's the typical fun of part 11 is it sends you out of part 11 and then you can go back to part 11 when you're using these compliance alternatives. You know what? That particular provision doesn't specifically say it only applies to existing ceiling. So the way that I see the path being followed is, yes, you can use a 15-minute barrier because you need 45. However, if you put fire alarms and the new provisions with the strobes and all bedrooms and all levels, you can put a 15-minute barrier on, and this 15-minute barrier you can find in the archaic materials manual, which talks about half-inch regular drywall meeting this provision. So I know a lot of building officials have some struggle with it a bit because it seems like it's not quite right. Why can't they put a new system like a new building? But I think the way part 11 is done, I think that is a viable option.
Someone's put a comment here. If someone's got questions on secondary suites, second units, in particular replacing the horizontal fire separation, there's a ministry guideline. It looks like that's posted. So the website link has been put in the chat there. That might be something people can refer to as well.
Yeah, that's a great document that goes through the secondary suite provisions in detail.
Sorry, I'm just trying to group all these questions together. What if an existing condition creates a hazardous scenario? Example is a headroom height above a primary exit for a new basement apartment.
So when we're dealing with conversions to a basement apartment, when we do the evaluation of change of occupancy, it specifically sends us to ceiling height provisions in part 9. So again, we've gone part 11, which sends us to 9, I think it's 9.5 of room sizes, right? So we've been specifically sent there. So I would then want to find that we have that minimum ceiling height in the building. However, like we talked about before, we also have to look at compliance alternatives. And compliance alternatives, I believe, allow up to a 6'5" ceiling height within the path of egress and over the required area of the room. So as long as you meet that 6'5", you are okay through the compliance alternatives. Now, the National Building Code also talks about in a specific situation. Now, we're not dealing with the National Code specifically in Ontario, but it does have allowances for secondary suites up to 6'1" sometimes. So that might be something to, if you've got a situation, you got nowhere to go, maybe propose that to the municipality. But 6'5" based on the compliance alternatives is really as low as you can go. If you have a situation where it's less than that, then it doesn't comply, and you may not be able to have that secondary suite.
I have seen before an alternative solution proposed for something like that as well. So not since working with RSM, but in the past there was a scenario that it was just not compliant with the headroom height. So an alternative was proposed and approved.
Okay, all right. And what did they do? Do you remember?
I think they just had to identify the low headroom. So they had to do something like put brightly colored tape or paint or whatever the case was.
And maybe a pad in case they hit their head.
Duck on your way out. I don't know.
Well, that's a good point, though. In all of our discussions here, there is alternative solutions that don't fit specifically in that box. So if somebody proposes an alternative solution, that also is an option.
Yeah, Dave's got a comment here. Some of the 4-inch puck lights housing art is metal. I've seen many of them. Do you consider this much like an octagon box penetration?
I do. I definitely do. If I could see anything that's similar to another compliance alternative, like an octagon box, and it's a box, it's not an octagon, but it's the same type of construction, I would then appropriate that and look at that as compliance with an outlet penetration. Yes, I would. Okay,
I think that kind of clears all of the assembly discussion points that we were dealing with. So I might just go and start from the bottom here, Gerald, because there's been some questions sitting here for a while, and we'll see where the discussion leads. But some municipalities require information from Part 3 for Part 11 submissions. How do you deal with that? So I'm not sure what really the question is. I'm wondering if it's Part 3 to determine additional aspects of the building so that they can see where the Part 11 hazard index and things like that sit.
Yeah, I think as a building official reviewing it, there's a lot of times where Part 11 will send you or refer to new code requirements. Like for instance, the one requirement that says if it's required to be non-combustible if it was new. So therefore you need to know the building area, the building height, and the 322 article that it would apply to. So sometimes that particular information is crucial in getting compliance. And of course, if you're sent back to Part 3 from Part 11, then those particular aspects need to be discussed, and that's likely why they've been asked for.
Oh, the question, so in addition to that, for example, classification for 32220.
Yes. Okay.
322 article to it.
Yeah.
So I think, go ahead.
No, I think you're right. You need to know 322 article in order to apply whether it needs to be a non-combustible building. I think that's one of the BCIN exam questions.
There you go. So a few comments on this too, just in relation to those who want to mix and match the use of Part 3 and Part 11. So a few comments that some people have required customers to use all of Part 3 or all of Part 11. Reason being is because there are reductions in Part 11 and some added protections in some areas, maybe that way to balance the reductions in other areas.
Yes, good point. Yeah, so I guess that was that comment on the one requirement that seems to require more in Part 11 than Part 3. That could be because of some other issues in another area of the building that have been reduced based on that.
Yeah, so I think that's something you need to look at. If it's over and above, obviously, go for it, but a very specific question here. What about reusing a 36-inch door during a Part 11 renovation for a Group D building? So that goes back to that reuse.
Yeah, I think, if it's a brand new barrier-free washroom, it's a new building system, 36-inch door only works with the offset hinges. That's an option. Make them put on the offset hinges. But I think that the requirements are clear. It's that 3.8 applies, so you would need the door that has the proper clearance in that particular case.
Comment here. Danny Huey had told me that you can't use both Part 3 or 11. The designer has to choose one. They don't have to use Part 11 if they choose to design under Part 3.
I see. So choose one or the other. Now, of course, if you go through Part 11, it's going to send you back to some Part 3 provisions. But I could definitely see Danny has a really, really good point there. It can get very confusing if you're picking and choosing.
Okay, how do you deal with a large suite, say 800 meters squared, being subdivided into 3 suites? The overall space requires barrier-free because of the area. We see demising wall permits to subdivide and then separate unit fit-up permits claiming relief from barrier-free.
Now, I think if we bring up the code under 11, Part 11, under the barrier-free provisions and extensive renovation, I think it relates to building or suite. So I think when we're dealing with applying barrier-free provisions to a building, we have the 3 items: substantially removing the walls in the building. It's got less than 8 inches from grade to the floor level, and the suite or building, I believe. Now it's kind of small on there. See, it's suite. See that in 11.332 sentence 2. It says the suite has an area greater. So if they're doing an existing building that's been in existence for 5 years and they are breaking it up to area. Now, here's the thing. If it's a fit up, it's a brand new building and the interior of that suite has never been finished. Some municipalities have different thoughts on it. A lot of them say that there's been no occupancy permitted in that suite, right? When we do a shell permit, it's just a shell, and then we do occupancy permits based on each of the suite building permits. So I think if you're doing an interior fit up, barrier-free applies. If it's an older building that's been gutted and they've divided it into 3 suites and they are a lot greater than 300 meters square, there is an argument that barrier-free does not apply. Doesn't seem like the right thing to do, but I think on the strict interpretation there, I think the argument is it's not required.
Someone made a comment, isn't there applicable law that deals with barrier-free?
No, there's, well, not specifically, no. So barrier-free is only applied through Part 11 if it meets those provisions of 3.8 of the building code. There is no applicable law. Now, government buildings, municipal buildings, they need to comply with it, not through the building code, it's through their own freedom of, the OADA requirements. So you may have particular provisions that they're required, but it's not through the building code.
Oh, so that's the discussion here now. It's talking about AODA.
Yeah, AODA doesn't apply to buildings. It only applies to municipalities, government agencies on their own, setting aside the building code. They are required as a public building to meet AODA standards, and they do that through their committees and whatnot. But through the building code specifically, there is no requirements other than the barrier-free provisions in 3.8.
Pavel's got another point here. Demising barrier-free suite into a few small suites, reduction of performance if we propose non-barrier-free now. So he's looking at is the performance level maintained?
So again, you only reduce the performance level if there's a specific sentence in Part 11 that says you've reduced the performance level. You need to have, like, I'm not sure how that would relate to barrier-free. I think barrier-free provisions are only brought in if it's a new building system. So you've got a new washroom or some new area, but we're dealing with extensive renovation. It's got to be over 300 square meters for the suite, 8 inches to the floor level, and you're substantially moving the walls.
So that would be the same for the question that just popped up here. There's a lot of old factories being changed into multiple suites, office and retail. So would you then require them to comply with 3.8?
So if we look, yeah, so I would look at the extensive renovation provisions. It indicates that, again, if those 3 issues, all of them are met, then barrier-free applies to that particular suite. So they need to ensure that they provide barrier-free provisions. So they may have existing washrooms that are in there. They need to be upgraded now to provide barrier-free, which would be a universal washroom. We have to deal with the issues of the power door operator. Thing to keep in mind too is, even say they're not over 300 square meters, we're thinking, oh my goodness, how they still need to provide the barrier-free light provisions, which are the second sentence of barrier-free in extensive renovations, which still requires vanity heights, certain grab bars. So it's not like you get away with everything. You either barrier-free full or barrier-free light, depending on those provisions.
A question here. When looking at the tables, when the size of a building falls into more than one category for the hazard index, for the least restrictive is permitted to be used, is it the higher or lower HI, the least restrictive?
So the higher the hazard index, the more restrictive it is. And I believe you apply the most restrictive provision. If we look at the beginning of Part 11 with that hazard index, where it talks about hazard index, it talks about if you have more than one, I think it's like a 322 article. If you have more than one hazard index, you apply the most restrictive.
Switching gears, for SB 10 compliance of new building systems, how are you applying SB 10? SB 10 is based on the whole building design. However, in renovations, there is often no building envelope scope. When you are asking for SB 10 checklist for the new mechanical and electrical systems, and how do you deal with buildings that would have been designed on a performance path rather than prescriptive?
So I always look at it on the building system method, if there was no additions at all, if it was an existing building, generally speaking, most projects, you're not substantially removing the exterior walls, right? You might be gutting out maybe it had no insulation, or you're maybe taking out the old insulation. I don't see any path of SB 10 compliance requirement through Part 11. It just simply doesn't ask for it. The only route could be is if you would consider it a new building system, which it's not a new wall. It's always been the same exterior wall. So I typically don't look at compliance of SB 10 through renovations, only for new additions, which there's an addition table in SB 10. And of course, if it's a new building itself. Now, if they completely removed a wall, an exterior wall, they had to put a brand new one back, I think the argument would be is, yes, you need to meet SB 10, but like you said, very difficult because it's not about the one wall. SB 10 is a very holistic view of the entire building system. So I would probably only apply insulation values based on but I don't really see a lot of that happening. I think most times people are gutting the insulation out. If they choose, if it had zero insulation before, it can have zero insulation now because it's maintaining the existing performance level.
Back to these barrier-free universal water closets for Part 11. Universal by whole building only is not. I'm not sure I understand the question.
So when you're applying Part 11, you're applying it to the particular suite with 3.8. And as we just talked about before, the area requirement is for the suite. So I think if you have a suite, and the area is appropriated to that particular suite. If you're over the 300 square meters, full barrier free. If you're under it, then you would do the barrier free light.
The previous question that we were just talking about in terms of SB 10. So more specifically talking about the mechanical and the electrical equipment. Any total gut of interior with all new ducts and HVAC. So what would you do for the equipment?
I think if you're putting in a new mechanical electrical equipment, then it's a new building system, then it needs to comply with new code. So yeah, new code, new building system, completely replaced. We got a report. Juanita has a good comment here on the hazard index. I think she's clarified what I was discussing before. When you're trying to choose the hazard index, again, lowest hazard index is the most restrictive. That's a good point because that's the worst case, right? If we have two occupancies, one's a 1 and one's a 10, we need to worry about the 1 because the 1 is the issue that's got to come up the highest. So thanks for clarifying that, Juanita. You're right. The hazard index of the lowest is right. And that's at the bottom of the hazard index tables. So I think what Pavel is getting at with the requirements for universal washroom. So the requirements is for the suite to determine whether or not you need to have barrier free in that suite. However, you don't apply it to the whole building because they're not doing any renovations in the rest of the building. So I would look at it as, we're doing a renovation in this suite. Do we apply barrier free? It does say building, but you're only doing construction in that suite. If you had an entire building, then of course it would apply to the whole building, but those provisions are for the suite.
I think that's most of the questions that are code specific. Colleen's got a question about future, just sort of comment for a future session about plans examination, possibly outlining a process of getting some discussion going about tips and tricks.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, I'll have to pull out some of our computers and maybe do some sharing on the screen of different tips and tricks we're doing with our plan review and discussions on it. No, that's a good point. We have a couple more to fit in there, so that's good.
Yeah. Pavel wants to know more about our membership as well. The mentorship, sorry.
The mentorship program that we have is mostly for building officials that we have, and because we support typically municipalities, and we do a lot of inspections. We spend days working with young building officials on inspections, helping them with plans exam. So that's the type of support that we've been doing for many municipalities in Ontario. Matt's got a good question here. I just noticed on here about accessibility of barrier-free washrooms and other suites. That's one can definitely be a controversial one. My opinion has always been, and it's basically because I'll be honest with you, in one municipality I was in, it had been done, and then we had allowed, I'm in pizza. You need to use the washroom or the barrier-free, you need to go to Mary Brown's Chicken, sir. And you know what? That might work for the first year, but then there's a change of ownership. And then Mary Brown's Chicken says, I'm tired of dealing with pizza patrons using our barrier-free. So my opinion is that it shouldn't be permitted in other suites. It has to be under the care and control of the whole building or the care and control of that suite. So I've never permitted, even if someone says they're providing washrooms in another suite, you know what, as a municipality, we have, how are we going to control the fact in that case? So in my opinion, I've never permitted that.
And I'm curious to know how many municipalities are actually allowing that, because we get that argument all the time on the designer side of things. They always want to do it. So whether they're just thinking they can, or someone's actually allowing it and getting away with it somewhere else, I don't know.
Yeah, you know what? And as a designer, I get it. Your job is to give your opinion on code compliance and help your client get through the process. And it doesn't say specifically in the code you can't do that, but I think to me the intent is that that's not permitted because it's not accessible. Because in an enforcement environment that building officials are, we do have to think of how we're going to enforce it in the future to a certain extent. And I think if you were to allow this all throughout your municipality, 10 years from now, it's going to be chaos because it's always going to be complaints. It's going to be because, a lot on the design side, you don't see the amount of complaints we get in, and we would be dealing with constant slew of complaints. I know what happened to me. I don't know if some of the inspectors from Cambridge are here, but I remember in Cambridge, we had a slew of comments, because let's be honest, they would say, well, we're takeout. We don't have any seats. You don't need washrooms. So it would have went through under that provision. Then the next day they add chairs at the window, and then we get complaints later on that they're, St. Mary Brown's Chickens is saying, "Hey, you can't. Why is Pizza using our washroom?" It's just something that's very difficult to enforce.
Mark was wondering if we have time to discuss where compliance alternatives under Table 10322B would apply.
Yeah, so I didn't really get deep into the compliance alternatives for a Part 10 review, but yes, compliance alternatives are also available for Part 10. So if you're doing your performance level review to determine if there's a reduction of performance level, and you find that, we've got a reduction performance level here, check the compliance alternatives. There may be an allowance for reduced requirement. So good point, Mark. Definitely check those. Then they are permitted. Compliance alternatives are permitted through Part 10.
A little bit of clarification. That was just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Barrier-free light does not send us to 3811.5, sentence 1 for clearances. 11332, sentence 3 sends us to 38236, and then to 38311, sentence 5. So just very specific on where it's sending you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that information. Certain provisions of barrier-free light are provided, and thanks for that clarification. But I think the biggest point I wanted to get across is people think, I don't need barrier-free. Well, you still need barrier-free light, so make sure you double check that.
When you have a renovation addition, the existing plumbing is ABS. The addition is required to be non-combustible, and they will be connected together. Do you leave the existing ABS?
So if you maintain, here's the thing, that a lot of people do work with, and I think we had this come up before. If work is done without a permit, it doesn't automatically mean it's existing. So sometimes it can get complicated. So if you have a building where you see that there's been some additional plumbing added without the benefit of a permit, I think the argument of keeping the ABS isn't there. Now, of course, judgments need to be made based on the fact that you could have a huge building with this, but essentially that's a different case. If it was put in with ABS and it was, you know, a 322 allowed it for the initial existing building, and now they're putting in some, they get triggered, they're going higher, they need to connect it, then again, it's an existing building system. It's allowed to be, it's to stay based on the fact that Part 11 only requires a new building system to go to other parts. If you're, you know, there's even an argument in Part 11 that says if you extend an existing system, to extend the ABS. So I would, in my opinion, you could keep the existing ABS if it was done with the proper permits, and then you could just extend anything else with the non-combustible pipe. A lot of people have the discussion of, well, why are we, you know, it's 99% non, you know, ABS. Why are you worried about this 1%? Well, my thought is that as we march through time, we can't apply new code provisions to existing buildings, but as we march through time, I think the flavor of the code is that we step up the requirements. So maybe today it's only 1 or 2%, but in 10 years they do another edition, and so that will be non-combustible pipe or whatnot. So I think the idea is we step through it. OAA Part 11 matrix. Yes, I think, yes, definitely. You want to provide a matrix for Part 10 or 11 to review. Matt gave a suggestion that it should be more detailed, which is a good point, but I don't think it's a bad OAA matrix. It's not. And it was, I think, collaborated with the Ontario Building Officials Association. So I think it's a good thing. I think what we were clarifying is that we should use it, but just with more detail.
I think that's it, Gerald.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We had over 100 people stay right to the end for this Q&A session. So I'm glad that everybody could stay. And thanks for the discussions. Thanks for the comments in the chat. We really appreciate that. And thanks for your attendance. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks for our next session on mezzanines. Take care.
Bye, everyone.